Hi everyone, my name is Anna and I welcome you guys back to another English video for our series Studies of the Brit Hadasha. Starting off with verses 1 through 4 of chapter 8, it says, When Yeshua came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and kneeled before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Yeshua reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said. Be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Yeshua said to him, See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priests and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Firstly, within these verses, we can read that after Yeshua came down from the mount, a crowd started following him. Within this crowd, we can find or we read that there was a leper man who was going to be healed by the Messiah. And this miracle of healing was the first miracle that Yeshua did within his ministry. This disease of leprosy, called tzara in Hebrew, is something that we have already studied in our series Torah Themes, specifically in chapter 13 of Leviticus for those who want to know more about this leprosy. If we remember, leprosy was a disease that not only appeared physically in parts of the body of such person, but also it appeared in objects such as clothes, and it also appeared in houses like the walls of the houses, the doors of the houses, the windows, etc. The person who had leprosy was because of a consequence of their sins. For that reason, it is why in the Torah, the Eternal ordered the people of Israel that whoever had leprosy within them had to be thrown out of the congregation, since this disease had no treatment in that time to cure it, and therefore could contaminate the rest of the people, and therefore all of them were going to be considered impure. Although within the scriptures we can read that there were some occasions where the Eternal was the only one who would be able or who could heal that person from this painful illness. And this is something that we see within these verses. Returning to the verses of this chapter, this man that approaches the Messiah with great confidence, having faith that Yeshua was the Messiah and that he had the ability to heal him from such illness, we can also see how this man asks for this healing in a humble way and not in an arrogant way, demanding to be healed. Since we can read that this man tells him, Sir, if you want, you can clean me. This condition in which this man found himself in not only represents a physical impurity of that man, but also represents the condition of the Israelite people who were living in impurity, spiritually speaking. Since, if we remember, these people had prostituted themselves to the pagan gods, and therefore it is why they fell into assimilation, and in addition, they abandoned their Creator and His instruction. This, at the same time, also represents our spiritual life when we used to live in transgressions, since we only lived for the flesh and did things that made us impure. But just as the Messiah cleansed this man of his disease, in such way, when we do teshuvah, when we return to the Father or to our Creator through the Messiah, we are cleansed through the Messiah, the only way of truth and life. Another topic that the Messiah mentions within these verses is about the sacrifice or the offering of the Mosaic law. This was corresponding to the purification of leprosy that this person had received, and therefore he had to offer certain offerings to the Eternal because of or due to this healing. For more information about this topic, in Leviticus 14 verses 4 to 32, it is talked about this. All of these mandates of the Mosaic law that Yeshua mentioned, we can read and we can come to the conclusion and also realize that Yeshua did not abolish them, because he had not yet fulfilled his surrender, and also he had not become that sacrifice as a perfect lamb. That is why the Messiah tells this man to go to the temple and to offer these offerings. Also, Yeshua tells him that through this act, it is that this person was going to become a testimony for the priests who were in charge of the temple. Because let's remember that leprosy had no cure. No man was able to cure it. There was no treatment for it in that time. And it was only the Eternal that was able to heal it. It was a miracle that the Eternal could only do. And in this case, this is what happened, but through his son Yeshua, it is that this man was healed. From verses 5 through 13, we can read that Yeshua, upon entering Capernaum, was approached by a Roman centurion, who, despite his Gentile origin, we can read that he feared the Creator and also recognized Yeshua as the Son of Elohim. We can read in these verses that this person approaches Yeshua not so he can receive a personal benefit, but he approaches Yeshua so he can ask him to heal his servant who was paralyzed with pain. And it is surprising to see that a person with such responsibility, with such title, such power, would care about his servant. And here we can see how humble this person was towards his servants. These verses say that Yeshua was willing to go to this person's house to heal his servant. And this act that Yeshua was willing to do was not only frowned upon the eyes of the Jews, because it was also considered something unsuitable, since among them the Jews believed that a Jew was not able or could not go to a Gentile's house because it was impure. Yeshua, being in this situation with this Roman person or this Roman centurion, he takes the opportunity to reveal what the prophet Isaiah said in Isaiah 49 verse 6 about other people who were not part of the Israeli lineage, but that they were coming to the Messiah to be healed, to find that salvation. Continue with verses 14 through 17, it says, When Yeshua came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law laying in bed with fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word, and healed all who were ill. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah when he said, He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. In these verses, we can read about the mother-in-law of the disciple Peter, who was one of the 12 disciples of the Messiah. It is reported, or it is said in these verses, that Yeshua, upon entering Peter's house, he sees the mother-in-law who had a fever that prevented her from getting out of the bed. That is why in these verses, it says that she was laying in bed. Seeing this sickness that Peter's mother-in-law was going through, we can read that Yeshua healed this woman without being asked for it. Here we can see once again the importance of the Messiah doing these miraculous acts to fulfill his calling in this world as the Son of the Eternal Father. After this healing, we can see that Yeshua later on continued to perform miracles, but this time we read that these miracles didn't have to do with people who had illnesses, but rather it had to do with people who had to be freed, from demon possessions that they had, or evil spirits that they had. This shows us how the Israelite lineage because they did not want a relationship with their creator and rather wanted to fall into assimilation with the other nations. They were found as people who were possessed by demons. And this is something very serious, something very sad at the same time. Because after all, it shows how that soul is living in an impurity and darkness, since it does not have the peace that comes from the Father. It is extraordinary to see how the Messiah, upon seeing this condition of these people, he does not rebuke them, he does not despise them, because he sees the need of these souls, which was to return to their Creator and his instruction. Furthermore, he also performs all of these miracles to fulfill in his ministry what the prophet Isaiah said in Isaiah 53 verse 4 about the suffering servant, who we will study later on, that represents the Messiah in his ministry. The prophet Isaiah said, "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by Elohim, stricken by him and afflicted." All these acts of mercy that the Messiah does becomes an example for human beings, or for us as human beings, because this teaches us the favor that we must show towards our peers. Because just as we used to live in sin, having our soul with impurities, the Messiah showed us the true love of the Father, the true peace that comes from the Father, becoming the only, or the Messiah himself becoming the only way back to the Creator. When we demonstrate this true love, this true peace that the Father gives us, when we show this towards our peers, we are fulfilling the commandment that we find in Leviticus 19 verse 18 that says, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Almighty." Later on in the Good News of Matthew, we will be able to read that the Messiah verifies the importance of fulfilling this commandment. And we will be reading this in Matthew 22, verse 39. Continuing with verses 18 through 22 of chapter 8, it says, "When Yeshua saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came and said to him, 'Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go.' Yeshua replied, 'Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.' Another disciple said to him, 'First, let me go and bury my father, and I will follow you.' But Yeshua said to him, 'Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead.'" In these verses, we can read that as a result of everything that had been said and done by the Messiah towards the crowd of the people, that is, because of his teachings and the miracles that he was doing, it caused many people to begin to follow him. And many of them, in reality, the majority of them, of the people who were within these crowds, only followed the Messiah to receive a personal benefit, such as a miracle, a healing, food, etc. But when these people, the moment that they realized what it really means to follow the Messiah, what it really required, many of these people turned away, because being a true disciple of the Messiah was not easy, and it is not easy even till our days, since they had to go through tests to strengthen their faith. It was not going to be an easy life. We can read later on in these verses how the true disciples came to die because of the Messiah, because they were teaching the message of salvation that the Messiah told them that they had to teach. And although in the disciples we can read that they didn't really care about their temporal life, because their gaze was on the heavenly promise, and this was something that the disciples had to put their focus on. And this is something that the people who wanted to follow the Messiah were not able to understand, and they were not capable of doing. The Messiah had also warned his disciples about this happening to them in Matthew 10 verse 22, saying, All men will hate you because of me, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this is what we can see being fulfilled in the life of the disciples. They didn't really care what the men could have done to them, but what they did care was being obedient and being faithful to the eternal Father and his service. And therefore, we can see that they were saved from their past life where they used to live in impurities. And in the same way, this also is a reminder for us nowadays as believers that we shouldn't care about what the man can do to us, but what the creator of our souls can do to us. And we must always maintain obedience towards the Father, so therefore we can be saved. In verse 19, we can also read that it is mentioned about a scribe who approached the Messiah. For those who don't know, the word scribe comes from the Latin word scriba, which in Hebrew it is called sofer, and it translates as secretary, copyist, or scribe. This term refers to a person educated and intelligent in the scriptures of the Father, no matter what economy or what part of an economy class they were from, since the only thing that these people would do was copy the sacred documents such as the scriptures, the Torah, and more. For the first time within this gospel, we can see that a person of such category with an understanding of the scriptures approaches the Messiah saying or asking him or telling him, I will follow you wherever you go. However, we can see that the response of the Messiah was, foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. The Messiah, within this response, he tells him, or he wants to tell him, that because he wants to follow the Messiah, he has to know that it was not going to be easy. After all, there was no specific place for them to settle, and secondly, they were all going to be mistreated by the people because of the teachings that they were going to give. In verse 21, we can see another person who wants to follow the Messiah, but before he does it, he tells the Messiah that he needs to bury his father. But we can read that the Messiah's answer to him was, follow me now. Let the dead bury their own dead. And reading this response, we can see the tough decision that this disciple had to go through or had to make with this situation, since it is his parents that the disciple was talking about. But it also becomes a teaching for us, or for us as people, and for us as people to prioritize beyond oneself. In the case of the disciple, his father was already dead, and he was only going to bury his body, something earthly, which at the end his time of living was over. There was no reason for him to be present at his father's funeral, since his soul was no longer living in the body. Seeing these two examples, it leads us to the conclusion that being disciples of the Messiah is not what we often believe or what we have been taught in some religions, since it is not only about saying that we believe, but it consists of actions of obedience to all of the Father's instruction, not just half, but all. In this way, we will be called Talmid, disciples or students of the Messiah Yeshua, since we only take his teachings for learning and not the teachings of another religion or of another person who say to have the truth. At the same time, being disciples also implies uprooting ourselves from everything, always keeping in mind that we are passing through this world for a temporary time, and for this reason, it is why we must always have the Eternal Father in first. We must always have him first, never putting any temporal things before the Father. And we must always keep in mind what the Apostle Paul wrote in Colossians 3 verse 2. Set your minds on things above and not on earthly things. Continuing with verses 23 to 27, it says, Then he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Yeshua was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him up, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. He replied, You of little faith, why are you so afraid? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. Then the men were amazed and asked, What kind of man is this? Even the winds and waves obey him. In these verses, we can read about the storm that Yeshua and his disciples went through in the middle of the lake. This lake takes place in the Sea of Galilee, which is 20 kilometers long from the north to the south and 14 kilometers wide from the east to west. The Sea of Galilee in reality is small, which is why it could be classified as a lake, but the reason why this place within the scriptures it is called the sea, it is called a sea, is because the Jews used to call these large areas of water seas back in their days. It is known that the storms that occurred in the Sea of Galilee occurred suddenly and violently in an unpredictable way. This is because in the west part there were hills where valleys and canyons were. So when these cold winds from the west started to blow, these valleys acted like gigantic fans that caused very strong winds towards the sea. And for this reason, it is why these storms were caused very harshly. In this situation of the storm, we can realize that it contains a message and teaching for the believer who reads it, since everything that is mentioned within these verses of what had occurred, it has a spiritual meaning for our life. Firstly, we can read that the boat is mentioned, and this boat represents the strength and security that we find within or that we have when the Messiah is present in our life. Secondly, it is mentioned about the waves of the water. This represents the nations. Thirdly, it is mentioned that while the storm was occurring, the Messiah was sleeping. This refers to the fact that when a person or when the Messiah is absent in a person's life, that is where the storm begins, meaning that in that moment, it is where we begin to face the tribulations of the world. Lastly, it is also mentioned within these verses about the strong winds that were occurring. This refers to the evil spirits that seek to torment us, but this only occurs when the Messiah is absent in our lives. In these verses, we not only see the miracle that Yeshua performs by calming this storm, which is obviously humanly impossible since it is the creation of the eternal that we're talking about. But through this miracle, Yeshua demonstrates the authority that the eternal Father had given to him. At the same time, we can read that his disciples, upon seeing this miracle, they were truly amazed, so much that they asked themselves what kind of man he was, exclaiming that even the winds and the waves obeyed him. In all of this, we can take the teaching and a reminder of how important it is to trust and have faith in the eternal Father until the second coming of the Messiah occurs. In the last verses of chapter 8, verses 28 to 34, we can read that once he crossed the lake with his disciples, they arrived to Gadara, one of the 10 cities of the Decapolis region, which was located on the northeastern coast. The verses these verses say that when Yeshua was there in this place, 2 men approached him who were possessed by demons who spoke through them. These demons that were in these men knew and recognized Yeshua as the Son of Elohim. And when they knew the judgment that was awaiting them, they begged Yeshua to allow them to dwell in the pigs that were in that place. And the Yeshua allows this to happen because let's remember that the pigs were considered as impure animals. Sadly, we can read that in these verses, the people of that place, upon seeing this miracle, instead of them rejoicing for the liberation that the Messiah had done for this man, on the contrary, they became upset and wanted Yeshua out of that place. And the reason why they reacted this way was because the pigs that were now possessed by those demons, they were not able to hold such thing, and therefore they perished on the cliff. Sadly, we can see that these people did not want to change their lives. They did not want to do teshuvah, and that is what currently nowadays continues to happen within humanity. Although not in the same situation with the pigs, but the problem of the human beings is that when we are forced to leaving certain practices that we receive a benefit and enjoy temporarily, we don't want to leave them. It hurts us leaving it. And that is to say that we don't want to make our carnal desires die. And therefore, it is why most of the time we put temporal things before the eternal service. And in these verses, this is something that we can read, and a reminder for us, once again, that we must be able to let go of all carnal desires that we may have, because at the end, our gaze should be in the heavenly promises and not in the temporal things. Continuing with chapter 9, verses 1 through 8, we read about the healing of a paralyzed man. In this passage, this condition is linked to the sins of that person. The Hebrew term for this would be chata, which comes from Hebrews 2403, and it refers to transgressing the instruction. This is why when Yeshua, in the moment that he was healing this man, he tells him in verse 2, "Take heart, my son, your sins have been forgiven." This not only has to do with a physical healing, but it is also a reflection of his interior, that is, of his sins. Because the moment that his sins are forgiven, he is given the opportunity to repent. It is important to mention that this repentment is not only about changing a mindset, but rather it is about returning to the Creator through the obedience to his true instruction. Another thing that we can read in these verses is the reaction of the scribes at the moment that they heard what Yeshua had told this man about his sins being forgiven. Here we can read that a conflict arose within the religious people of that time, considering and even labeling Yeshua as a person who was blaspheming, and this conflict is something that continues within our days, as it has been given various interpretations, and even Trinitarian concepts have been added to this labeling of blaspheming. As believers, we must not allow these religious conflicts to distract us from what truly was happening within this time or inside this healing of this paralyzed man. Because let us remember that the Eternal Father had given all authority to the Messiah to perform miracles, healings, liberations, etc. Obviously, the Messiah being only the means for the eternal to be exalted, just as we can read what had occurred in verse 8. When the crowd saw it, they were afraid, and they exalted the Eternal who had given such authority to men. From verse 9 through 13, we can read the call of Matthew, the author of this gospel. His original name, we can read that it was Levi, and also it was Ben, which means son of Alphaeus. In these verses, we can read that the Messiah gives him the name of Matthew, which comes from Hebrew 4993, which is Matityahu, which means gift of the eternal. And this gift consisted of being called by the Messiah. And we can read this calling in verse 9, which says, "As Yeshua passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, 'Follow me,' and he rose and followed him." Here we can read Matthew's disposition, how he immediately answered to the calling of the Messiah and left everything behind without thinking about it twice. In these verses, or in this verse, we can also read that Matthew was dedicated to collecting taxes for Rome as well as for himself, thus maintaining Roman peace and peace within himself. This is why this work was not well regarded, it was not well known, and was also related to betrayal and fraud. But here we can see that despite the life he led as a tax collector, the Messiah still calls him. This also happened with other people such as publicans and those who lived without any type of education in the instruction, and these people were not well regarded within the society. The religious of that time, upon seeing these calls that the Messiah was making, indirectly questioned his disciples and not the Messiah himself. Yeshua, when listening to what the religious people were asking his disciples, he told them, but when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick are in need of it." Although these words do not mean that the religious are well or were in the correct, but rather Yeshua went to those who had a need, who had that necessity, and not to those who believed they were well. With this, he continues saying in verse 13, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." From verses 14 to 17, we read about the topic of fasting. In these verses, the fact that Yeshua says that it was not the ideal time for his disciples to be fasting, it does not mean, or we have to understand that it doesn't mean that they were never again going to do this practice of fasting. Since the Messiah, in verse 15, he says, "And Yeshua said to them, 'Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast.'" Yeshua in these verses explains this topic of fasting in figures of prophetic and logical aspects. Yeshua did not remove this type of practice that the disciples rigorously followed. On the contrary, we can come to the conclusion, and we can even see, or we have already seen, that he taught the correct way to carry out this practice of fasting in the correct way. And we can find this in Matthew 6, verse 16 through 18. From verses 18 through 34, we can read more miracles that the Messiah does for the people. In all of these miracles, we can see that the Messiah shows himself modest and humble with the simple purpose of doing good towards his neighbors or towards his peers. And in this way, he was fulfilling what was written about him in the prophecies. In these miracles that we read within these verses, we can see Israel itself being shown in the lives of the people who were with these sicknesses. The first miracle that we can see, or the first miracles that we can see the life of the Israelite people within these people, was with the two women who were in an impure state. And this healing we can find in verses 18 through 26. Another case that we can find or another miracle that we read within these verses 27 through 31, was the healing of the two blind men. These two cases point to the two houses of Israel that were divided. On one hand, let's remember that there was the northern kingdom through Ephraim, and on the other hand, there was the southern kingdom through Judah. Both of these two houses of Israel were in a condition of impurity. More than physical, it was in a spiritual way, since they were spiritually blind. Another miracle that we see within these verses is of a mute person who speaks again once the Messiah expels his demons. It is in this miracle that we can read that while some of the people seeing this act or seeing this miracle that the Messiah performed in this person, they were amazed by it. But on the other hand, like the religious people, they attribute these miracles to the prince of the demons called Beelzebub. This is obviously incorrect, because let's remember, just as I have said throughout this video, the Messiah only obeyed the Father's instruction. He only did what the Father ordered him, and he was only fulfilling with his call. Therefore, these miracles, he did not do them because he was being because they belonged to the prince of the demons. This was obviously incorrect. To end this video, or to conclude with analyzing these two chapters, the last verses of chapter 9, verses 37 through and 38, we can read that the Messiah continued with his ministry in teaching and also healing the people, just as it had been written in the prophecies. Yeshua, upon seeing all of the people who were in need of hearing his message of salvation and the importance of returning to the Father through him, Yeshua found it necessary to speak to his disciples in a parable as a prior preparation to what they had to do later on. Yeshua tells them, "Then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Father of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest fields.'" And well, here we can see once again how these workers, it was referring to these disciples who were now going to have the role or the responsibility to speak or to teaching the message of salvation to the rest of the nations. And this is something that later on we're going to be studying in the rest of the Gospels, and also in the rest of the cards that the apostles wrote to the nations. And well, this is all for today's video. Thank you very much for your time, and we will see each other in the next one. Bye.